Appreciate that kind introduction. It was about 10 or 11 years ago, while Director of Land and Nutrient Management at Murphy Farms, which basically meant I was responsible for the environmental compliance at some 700 hog farms, that I received a call from a gentleman at Cantor Fitzgerald atop the World Trade Center. And he explained to me the notion of climate change and global warming. He explained the notion of a yet-to-be-developed carbon market, and the currency of this carbon market would be a carbon credit. He described what a carbon credit would be in theory and such. And at the end of that conversation, he wanted to move towards tying up the rights to capture and destroy methane from all of our hog legumes as a way of generating carbon credits. Well, I got to tell you, I thought the guy was spewing a lot of hot air, if not had been smoking crack. I had never heard anything so ridiculous in my life. I just really was not enough of a futurist to embrace what he was telling me. Well, fast forward 10 years, and here we are today. The carbon markets have developed. Carbon credit is definitely an international currency. And I have obviously bet my future career path on it being a hot opportunity. So let's dive in and talk a little bit about what it is and how it may impact the pork industry. I think, let me give you a little bit of a background in this. Obviously, we have a highly educated audience. And for most of you, I'm sure this will be a bit of a review, but let's all get on a common level. What is the greenhouse effect? What is climate change? What is global warming? It's simple. Essentially, this diagram here shows that the sun, solar radiation comes down to the earth. A lot of that comes back. But with the growth in human population, we are having an anthropogenic influence in the amount of greenhouse gases. There's 6 greenhouse gases. The 3 most important to us are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Because of the increase in these greenhouse gases, it is causing a lot of that heat or infrared radiation to be reflected back to the earth, and the atmospheric scientists tell us that the earth is warming. So that is basically what the greenhouse effect is. Now, different greenhouse gases have different... Yes.
Question.
Yeah.
I have an editorial here.
Okay.
And this is an editorial from Feedstocks. And it's in reference to that last slide, if you just go back.
Okay. Yep.
Where global warming is not unequivocal. It's clearly not. Because this editorial says the net global warming from 1940 to 1998 was a tiny 0.2 degrees Celsius. And that was during, and it says since 1998, temperatures haven't risen at all. Over the past 18 months, the thermometers and satellites both reported a sharp global cooling. And let's see, the oceans stopped warming 4 to 5 years ago, and the northern Pacific has entered a cooling phase that is likely to dictate cooler global temperatures over the next 25 years. Clearly not unequivocal.
Okay, is Jan still in the room? Do we have a room monitor or a sergeant at arms here? We've obviously got a troublemaker, Jan. Can you take care of that for me?
That's why I'm retiring.
Thanks for that, Bob. Actually, did you mention that this is from Dennis Avery? Dennis Avery's a great guy. I respect Dennis, but he is on an island of one. He is on way out there on the fringe by stating that the global warming is a figment of our imagination. I'm not an atmospheric scientist. I don't have the time nor the desire to study the hundreds of thousands of pages of writing that have been generated over this phenomenon that we've been debating now for literally over 20 years in this country. But this intergovernmental panel on climate change is made up of several hundred of the preeminent atmospheric scientists around the world, many of which come from the United States. And they agree that global warming is unequivocal. Now, a lot of us in this room have had scientific training. You cannot buy off or politicize an issue amongst that many scientists. Maybe a scientist here or there, but an international body of scientists that has been studied this issue in depth and analyzed tremendous volumes of data that have come to this conclusion. That's good enough for me.
Well, we'll let you go on.
Okay. Just watching Jan. Okay. There are 6 different greenhouse gases. We talked about that. But the interesting thing is they're rated in terms of global warming potential. So the common denominator, the international currency, is carbon dioxide because that is the most prevalent greenhouse gas. However, methane, of course, is very important in animal agriculture, specifically the pig business as well. But the global warming potential, or the potential to heat the earth, is 23 times more powerful for methane than it is for carbon dioxide. For nitrous oxide, 296, some estimates, 310 times more powerful. So, why is that important? If you can capture and destroy a ton of methane, you're essentially generating 23 tons of carbon credits, because a carbon credit is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. All right, so why has this become an issue? Obviously, the human population has dramatically increased. Today, we're a little over 6 billion people. Most estimates are that within 40 years or so, we are going to have 9 billion people on this earth. What has happened? What are the atmospheric scientists telling us has happened here? Since around 1850, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has dramatically increased because of the emissions of greenhouse gases, or carbon dioxide equivalent. I think this quantifier here is billion metric tons. There's also been, as the human population has increased, obviously dramatic changes in land use, clearing of forests for agriculture and/or industry and/or suburbia. Let's take a look at some more data that I think would probably refute Dennis Avery here. The carbon dioxide concentration is today about 385, 390 parts per million. The climate change models say that were we not to do anything between now and 2050, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere could be as high as 800 to 1,000 parts per million, which some say could bring about catastrophic consequences in terms of dramatic increases in sea level rise of, 10 to 20 feet, the displacement of hundreds of millions of people away from the low-lying coastal regions, widespread drought, widespread famine, increased incidence of severe weather events that could bring about tremendous calamities. Some attribute some of the things we've seen recently to climate change. Don't know if that's true or not. That is what some people predict are the dire consequences if we don't take action. And so the goal amongst most atmospheric scientists is to try to maintain this level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to potentially offset some of these catastrophic consequences. Now, carbon dioxide has increased, and so has temperature. A lot of you would say, big deal, 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit increase over decades and decades and decades. Apparently, that's a big deal. It doesn't sound like a big number, but it does have consequences. Here's one more piece of data that would show that it's a review of the carbon dioxide concentration here, but it also shows that over time we've also seen a dramatic increase as the population has exploded in the atmospheric concentration of methane and nitrous oxide. This y-axis here shows the population, and a pretty good correlation between the increase in the population, the human population, and the increase in these greenhouse gases. We doing okay, Bob?
So far.
Okay. Now, why does that matter? Why does that matter to you folks? Our office, or our company, is headquartered in the UK, and you see this was the headlines in the Sunday London Times paper, the main paper for the United Kingdom. And this high official within the United Nations says, look, if you want to tread lightly on this earth and be kind and help solve global warming, you need to eat less meat, if not eliminate it from your diet altogether. That is going to have an impact on our business, and it's important to understand what's coming down the pipe. The Carbon Disclosure Project, I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it is some 385 institutional investors, perhaps a few less now, but controlling $57 trillion, have basically, it's a voluntary effort today, asking corporations that they loan money to or involve financially with to tell us what your carbon footprint is, number one, and then what are you going to do about it, number two, in terms of reducing it. Because global warming is such an important issue to the people in the financial community. Now, this guy right here, of course, has been the face of climate change, winning the 2007 Nobel Prize along with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scientists. And if many of you are like me, it kind of makes you want to dismiss the whole issue because of the sky is falling sort of cries, and that can it really be that bad? Can these potential consequences really occur when we've seen a 1.2 degree increase in temperature, if that? And so it tends to make me a skeptic. It tends to perhaps make you a skeptic. But I do think that this is not a fad. The message is very clear. Global warming is probably not going to go away as being a very important issue. The emissions of greenhouse gases associated with the production of pork in this country and globally is going to be looked at. It's going to be demanded to be decreased over time. Any publication that you look at today is talking about sustainability. Sustainability is not a corporate fad. It is a very, very important hot topic. And global warming, or greenhouse gas emissions associated with whatever a corporation does, is becoming very important, and obviously the effort is to try to decrease that. Any questions, comments, rebuttals at this point?
I have a question.
Yes.
So, if I'm interested in minimizing my impact with regards to my diet, I can go to bonappetit.com, or I can go to eatlowcarbon.org, and I can check out the contribution of my pork chop to climate change or carbon emissions. So maybe I should eat organic pork. That'll decrease my contribution.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little later in this presentation about carbon footprinting, how you do it, why it's important, and so I'll talk some more about that. But definitely, I think there's a very tiny part of the population in this country today that makes their food choices based upon the carbon footprint. That's more prevalent, certainly, in the European Union, and today you can find products on the store shelves of Tesco, which would be sort of a Walmart equivalent in the EU, that have, in addition to the nutritional information on the back, a picture of the globe and the grams associated in terms of carbon dioxide, the carbon footprint of producing that product. And so people, our children, are going to be encouraged to think about their food choices in terms of what impact that's going to have on global warming. It's going to become more prevalent. At that website you mentioned, I've been to that website. You can choose a chicken burrito and drag it over into the skillet. It's called, I think, eatlowcarbon.org. Also, Bon Appetit has this website. You can drag your food choices, whether it's a steak, a pork chop, a breast of chicken, or spinach, and drag it over, put it in the skillet, and immediately you have a thermometer with a bulb that is green, yellow, and red associated using some sort of carbon calculator, and it tells you what the carbon consequence is of your choice, your food choice, and it's pretty telling. It's not very kind to me. for sure. But now with organic, obviously organic, and this is going to become an interesting controversy over time, because the environmental community would want us to either go vegetarian or certainly to go organic. And organic foods is not very carbon friendly. Efficiency is carbon friendly. We'll talk about that some more. Okay, so what drove this whole notion of carbon markets? And it's essentially policy. And the driving international policy, all of you have heard of it, is called the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was created by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I believe the meeting was in Kyoto, Japan in 1997, where this framework was laid out. 160 some countries agreed to reduce by the year 2012 their overall greenhouse gas emissions by 6%, based upon a baseline of emissions in the year 1990. The United States was a big player. Most people don't realize this, was a big player in the Kyoto Protocol, was very much a driver for getting credit for land use change, for decreasing emissions associated with agriculture, but came back home and essentially decided we signed the Kyoto Protocol, we did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and essentially every other country in the world did ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And our concerns were that it would cripple our economic growth in this country by agreeing to those reductions because of the cost of complying with this cut in greenhouse gas emissions.
I believe India and China did not ratify also. So if we go ahead and invest money to decrease our emissions, we're sending jobs overseas.
Well, India and China are both labeled as developing economies or economies in transition. And we have a large office in China. And when we accuse them of not agreeing to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions, their immediate reply is, what are you talking about? You have had you being the United States has had your industrial revolution. The European Union has had your industrial revolution. Let us have ours. Your carbon footprint, being an average American, is like 45 tons of CO2 emissions per person per year, because we live in big houses, we burn a lot of fuel in our SUVs, and we travel in planes a lot and such. The average person from China's carbon footprint would be about 2 tons. So don't tell me, speaking as as someone from China here, don't tell me to decrease or to agree to reduce my carbon footprint or my emissions overall. That would be sort of the thinking or the debate that's going on there. Okay, so this diagram, we could really get way down in the weeds when we talk about the Kyoto Protocol and how this policy has created a market, and it is a very complex. I continue to learn more about it every day. I've been exposed to it for a few years now, but we're going to try to just take a very high-level overview of what it is and then how it has impacted what's going on here in the United States, because I think that's more relevant to you. I seriously doubt the United States will ever ratify the Kyoto Protocol. I think we're going to go in a direction of agreeing to curb greenhouse gas emissions, but I think it's going to be more on our terms. Essentially, the driver of the Kyoto Protocol has been these developed economies in the 27 member states of the European Union. And then you have all these other countries that are involved except the United States. And essentially, the way the Kyoto Protocol works is in creating a market for the trading of carbon credits. It has transferred a lot of wealth, hopefully in the form of sustainable development, to, and for the most part, the Southern Hemisphere, to countries with economies in transition, or economies that are least developed. So, to inform you of a few more basics about the carbon markets, the carbon credit is a certified, verified reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that's equivalent to a metric ton of carbon dioxide. And everything is brought back to this common denominator of equivalent CO2e, depending on what greenhouse gas you're talking about. And for a carbon credit to be traded in the international markets, or for a carbon credit to be traded in the domestic market here today in what I would call a high-quality carbon credit, it has to meet essentially three very important tests. One is additionality. And the three words to remember associated with a high-quality carbon credit is you cannot get credit, you cannot trade for doing business as usual. And that's going to become an even more controversial topic in this country, because today, with the early advent of the voluntary carbon markets, there are farmers, perhaps some of you either know or are taking advantage of the ability to create carbon credits for doing things like no-till farming. But no-till farming for a lot of people is business as usual. You implemented it for other reasons. You did it to conserve soil moisture. You did it to conserve soil compaction. You did it to conserve fuel. It's been shown and proven that you can get acceptable, if not superior, crop yield by doing limited tillage or no-till. But yet there are ways, and there are companies that will issue you carbon credits for doing that practice. The rest of the world and the very high quality carbon credits in this country will not allow you to get paid for doing business as usual. The practice that destroys greenhouse gas emissions, or the practice that sequesters greenhouse gases, you have to prove that it was not business as usual, that it was additional to the emissions that would have occurred in the absence of the project. It's taken me a while to get my head around that thing, but I think I finally do understand it. The second test is permanence. If you're going to get paid for a high-quality carbon credit, you have to prove that the carbon is never going to come back, that it's never going to be emitted. When you capture methane from a hog farm via a lagoon cover or via a digester, and you flare that methane or you combust it in a genset, it will forever be gone. It is permanently gone forever. So it's easy to meet that test. However, if you got paid to do no-till farming and 4, 5, 6 years later you till that field, the soil respiration that occurs allows a tremendous amount of that carbon to be released into the atmosphere. So the buyer of that carbon really didn't get anything in that case. The third thing would be leakage. Leakage is a kind of an unusual term, but you have to prove to a body of skeptics and experts that the practice that you took on your farm did not result in increased greenhouse gas emissions somewhere else. For instance, if you took 1,000 acres out of production that was in soybean production and you planted it into trees, you're going to sequester a lot of carbon. However, the skeptic would argue that to meet the markets today, somebody else is going to go out here and clear X acres of timber and plant soybeans, and that's going to result in some increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to go through very difficult calculations to demonstrate that there's not going to be significant leakage, or if there is leakage, that you have to deduct that from the total. Okay, so the driver for the carbon market as dictated by the Kyoto Protocol, carbon markets would not exist without policy. Policy drove the markets. Is the notion of the cap and trade and offset system. So the next few slides will explain this. What the European Union has done, and their 27 member states have basically capped emissions over the primary sectors of the economy that have the greatest greenhouse gas emissions. In Europe, just like here, they have environmental agencies that are responsible for regulating these industries. They have permits with these environmental organizations, and they report annually what their emissions are. And so the countries that participated in the Kyoto Protocol agreed to put a cap over emissions and over time reduce it. So then each country goes back and decides how they will hand out essentially permits to pollute. And this whole system was basically copied from the very successful system that was created in this country to trade on NOx and SOx. Rather than EPA telling these industries in this country that you will implement technology A and you will do it this way or that way, they basically put a cap over NOx and SOx emissions and let the free market system figure it out. And it was a resounding success because the economic impact of reducing NOx and SOx emissions in this country was far, far below what the predicted level was. The cap and trade system for the Kyoto Protocol was copied from that system. And so let's say you're a country in Europe, your government then hands out essentially permits to pollute at these levels, and in this case the level of the cap is at 100 metric tons for the sake of simplicity. And this is the cement sector, this is heavy manufacturing, the chemical industry, this is certainly the utility sector, always the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. This is petroleum refining, this is the chemical industry. Typically, these are the largest sectors of the economy that contribute the greatest to greenhouse gas emissions. Sectors of the economy outside this cap, even in a very strict and carbon-conscious Europe, is agriculture. Agriculture is a minor contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. In this country, roughly 6 to 7% of our emissions come from agriculture as a whole. Certainly consumers, other sectors of the economy, finance, services, tourism, all sorts of, basically every other sector of the economy is outside this cap. Now, well, let me back up and say that there's also being talked about, to date, all of these permits to pollute have been handed out. In this country, we're debating having an auction for these permits to pollute, and that it could raise hundreds of billions of dollars, and then how would the government use that? Time will tell whether or not we do that. But an allowance then is created because once the government hands out these permits to pollute, you'll find that various companies are in various stages of implementing new technology. Some new technology will dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but if you're a company that, say, 3 years ago just put in new technology that did not make a drastic cut in greenhouse gas emissions, but still has a 20-year lifespan, it's going to be extraordinarily expensive for you to completely replace that equipment with newer, cleaner technology. So it may be far cheaper for you to buy an allowance from a company here that had more allocation than they need. They had 5 metric tons to sell to this company. So today there's a very active market of what's called European Union allowances. The average price today is around 30 euros or $40, $45, something like that for a European Union allowance. Now, an offset is where you can create emission credits or carbon credits in sectors outside the cap. And in this case, a hog farm, a dairy farm, by capturing methane via a cap lagoon or a digester, because that is not business as usual. Business as usual is allowing those greenhouse gases to escape into the atmosphere. And it is not common, it is not widespread to have digesters on farms. And so the thinking is that this drives technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an unregulated sector. We don't have air permits. Where we have fugitive emissions, agriculture is very difficult to regulate. But this market system has created a way to drive technology onto the farm, an economic incentive to do that, which is good. And then you can bring in these carbon credits into the regulated community and decrease the overall hit, the economic impact of them having to comply with this cap. And it's not worth going through the math. Hopefully I've demonstrated the concept here of how this thing works.
So if I have a dairy and I put in something today, let's say, to capture the methane, what happens when this legislation goes into place, assuming it does? and I've already done it. How do I prove that it's now additional when I did it 3 years ago?
There are, most of the standards today would allow you to go back up to 6 years. If it was before that, then you couldn't, because it's such a new practice, you would still receive credit for it. However, there's some debate when we have federal regulation that there may not be any grace period. Time will tell. Other questions? Yes.
Hold on a second. Nobody can hear you.
So a company who's a heavy manufacturer, a big inventor of all this stuff, the smart money for them is to sell all their carbon credits, 100% of whatever they're doing, and move their factory over to China, right?
That's an interesting argument, and whether or not that's occurring, I don't know, and whether or not you would be able to sell your credits and then shut down the industry, I don't know the rules. That's a good question. I would imagine there's some controls to prevent that, but I honestly don't know.
They probably wouldn't have to do any type of carbon emission limitations in China, which is probably why China is the number one carbon emitter in the world. Is that right?
I think we are, in terms of per capita. In terms of by country, you're probably right. Yes, you're probably right about that. But there's, some, 2.5, 3 billion people that live there. So that would be, the argument or consideration. Another thing, too, that I failed to explain, and why this also affects or is effective, is if you don't comply with this cap, what are the penalties? Well, as of January 1st of 2008, if you're in the European Union and you don't comply with this cap, the penalty is 100 euros per ton over the cap that you emitted. So obviously it's far cheaper for you to trade in carbon credits or perhaps implement technology that's going to decrease your emissions. or go to China, perhaps. Okay, so in international offset, we've talked a bit about carbon credits and the market, but essentially the term for an offset credit that I just described coming in from outside the cap is called a certified emission reduction. And that is where it's this sort of transfer of wealth and encouraging sustainable development in least developed countries. For instance, building a windmill that would displace coal-fired generation of electricity in India. The goals are to produce sustainable development, to transfer technology to the developing world, to make quantifiable reductions in carbon emissions, and to obviously reduce the cost of compliance. So a sample CDM project, and one of the early pioneer firms who unfortunately has fallen on hard times, it was created by, Al, or at least one of the founders of the company, Al Tank with AgCert, was one of the first to go out here and implement projects in South America and Mexico on hog farms and dairy farms to capture methane by either covering lagoons or implementing biodigesters. And this is our illustrious Dr. Morrison here on the right, who in this case leaped higher than a tall building to get on top of that covered lagoon, which is obviously full of biogas. And that biogas is then is generating electricity via a small genset, and that electricity put onto the grid. And by monitoring that and going through a very complicated, very intensive process of calculations and proof and third-party validation and separate third-party verification, you can earn carbon credits from that process. And again, in the interest of time, it's the gist of this slide is that a high-quality carbon credit that's either traded internationally or a carbon credit that's created for the voluntary market in this country, which is very what we would call CDM-like. It has to meet some extraordinarily strict standards. And basically, if I, as a carbon aggregator, to create a high-quality carbon credit, I have to lay out a case to a panel of skeptics, to a panel of scientists that proves that this carbon credit is going to result in a real, verified reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Garth, how do you establish value, or what's the value of those voluntary credits? How is that established?
Well, it's obviously the marketplace, but in Europe, there's as part of the Kyoto Protocol, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme was created and is now trading carbon credits for what's called Phase 2, and that's the period 2007 through 2012. What happens post-2012 will be decided by what's called the Conference of Parties that will meet in December 2009 in Copenhagen. And that's what we will figure out what happens after 2013 and beyond with regard to policy, with regard to the carbon markets. All indicators are that we're not going to abandon the cap and trade and offset system. In this country, what's that? In this country, it's a supply and demand. Nobody has to do a darn thing with regard to reducing carbon emissions in this country. But I'll talk shortly about why there is demand. This slide shows the distribution of the type of projects. You'll be interested to see that the livestock projects are about 12% of the overall total that have come about. So, are carbon markets real? Yes. In this country, in 2007, the vast majority of the voluntary market was in the United States. It's a total of about $331 million value. The wholesale price for an over-the-counter trade was around $6 per metric ton. A CCX price was about $3.15. This lower price is reflected in the concern that some buyers have that some of those credits are not going to hold up under a federal compliance regime, under a federal cap and trade system, because some of those credits, people would argue, do not meet the test of additionality or leakage or permanence. Some do. The compliance market in 2007 was $66 billion. The majority of that was trading of allowances between the regulated sectors of the economy. About 21% of that $66 billion, or roughly $14 billion, was the sale of carbon credits generated from offsets, from projects outside the capped economy. And the sale price for a CER, as opposed to a European Union allowance, is about $22, a lower price. The market in the United States alone is estimated, and you know estimates, but it's estimated, the figure is batted around a lot. By 2020, we'll be trading over $1 trillion in carbon credits in the United States alone. It's a big deal, and it's coming. It'd be worth your time, I think, to learn a bit about it. Okay, so let's talk about the voluntary carbon markets, because it is really the basis. The Kyoto Protocol that I've explained is essentially the basis for how the voluntary carbon markets have developed. The voluntary carbon markets have been fraught with a lot of scamming, with a lot of very low quality, questionable type of carbon credits in the last few years, because nobody has to do a darn thing. Nothing is regulated. The common terminology for carbon markets in this country is it's the wild, wild west, because there ain't no sheriff in town. And that is rapidly changing. The buyers of carbon credits in this country are becoming much more discerning. They know the difference between a high quality and a low quality carbon credit, and the prices are becoming reflective of that knowledge. And so what has cropped up in the absence of federal regulation, in the absence of a watchdog agency, is numerous standards. And thankfully for you, I'm not going to go through the details of this slide, but suffice it to say that here is just a sampling of the various voluntary registries that dictate protocols that you must meet to be certified by their organization and to retire your carbon credit. If you're an emitting sector, a utility in the Xcel Energy, let's say, and you want to get credit in your corporate social or sustainability report, or perhaps prove to the equivalent of EPA in this state that you have reduced your carbon footprint, you will have to show that you retired some carbon credits that you have purchased, or you will have to prove to them that you also decreased your emissions internally through your actions. But these various standards have means of tracking the carbon credits to show that they've been created according to their standards and then ultimately retired, so that they can't be double counted or sold 2, 3, 4 times. Voluntary. Who is buying carbon credits? There's not a regulated community. It's all voluntary. Businesses are buying it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's risk mitigation. Carbon is going to respond to supply and demand. Everybody that's close to this knows that the United States is going to pass federal regulation probably in the next 2 years. Both McCain and Obama are in favor of a cap-and-trade system. 10 minutes? Okay. We are going to have a federal regulation in this country. When we do, the demand for carbon is going to go up dramatically, and with it, the prices. So if you are a corporation that has a big carbon footprint, you essentially have a big liability. It might be smart to begin to demonstrate that you're reducing your carbon footprint, your carbon emissions by X%. And the hope is, and there's absolutely no guarantees, that by taking action now, when it's cheaper, when carbon's selling for $3, $4, $5, $6 a ton, instead of some people predict $60, $70 a ton, that you are going to get in early and you're going to get in cheap. Who knows what the price is going to be in the future? But businesses are taking action for risk mitigation purposes, for PR purposes, to prove to their shareholders, their stockholders, their customers that they're doing the right thing. The voluntary certification measure that has emerged as being the most popular is what's called the voluntary carbon standard. Project types, busy slide, but essentially similar to the international world, a whole different series of ways that you can earn carbon credits. Now, if you think that it's always going to remain voluntary, it's not. Future regulation is coming, even if for some reason the federal regulation is not passed. Today, in the United States, there has already been created, because the states are fed up with the federal government not taking action, they have taken action themselves. And again, we could spend a lot of time on this slide. We will not. Regulation, this is coded in state-by-state legislation. This is what's happening in this country. And basically, this is called RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Midwestern Accord, the Western Climate Initiative, and the most severe, of course, is AB 32. 32 million people living out here, and the state government has said that you will curb, you being the regulated sector of the economy, your emissions by 70% by the year 2050. Now, to your point back there, do you think if you're a heavy emitter of greenhouse gases, you're going to move across the state line? Probably a lot of incentive to do that, and it's a big concern for people in California. But that's what has already been created through state regulation. And whether or not federal regulation will come in and completely erase all that or not, or recognize it, who the heck knows? It's going to be interesting to see. Now, let's bring it home. What is it? How does this impact you as professionals in the pork industry? Well, livestock does have a long shadow. Yes, agriculture can be a part of the solution, but agriculture is certainly a big part of the problem. And the author of this report, which came out from the Food and Agriculture Organization, says that livestock has a long shadow, and it's especially critical of, as you can see, the ruminants, because of the enteric emissions of methane. The livestock in total is estimated to have anywhere from 10 to 18% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. That would include the feed production the emissions that occur from producing feed to feed to our animals. But that is the equivalent to the entire global transportation sector. That's a big carbon footprint. And what has so many atmospheric scientists concerned is that meat consumption is going to continue to dramatically increase over the next 20 years as disposable income increases amongst the least developed nations in this world, which is good news for us. But it comes with a carbon footprint that atmospheric scientists and environmentalists are saying, "Whoa, wait just a minute here. This is bad for global warming." Where do we contribute? A big part of it is from the application of fertilizer, from the decomposition of manure, land conversion to agriculture, a total of 17 to 32%. And this slide would simply show a little more detail where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from in agriculture through land use, application of fertilizer, decomposition of manure, burning of residue in the fields, emissions from the stack of farm machinery, emissions from stationary internal combustion engines to irrigate with, and so on. So, how do you determine a carbon footprint? It's essentially the total greenhouse gas emissions that are caused directly or indirectly. You can measure a carbon footprint for anything. For a lifestyle, I said 45 tons for the average American. For an organization like a company, for an event like this, I've been to several events where the moderator would stand up and proudly proclaim that the carbon footprint of the organization has been offset by your registration fees paying for carbon credits emitted from Project X. And so you can calculate carbon footprints for getting here. For products, I mentioned some products in the EU are being labeled according to their carbon footprint. I think that says 75 grams of CO2 was emitted from this packet of onion crisps. I jumped on the web this morning and saw that by flying here round trip from Raleigh, Durham to Minneapolis, that one seat on the airplane that I occupied emitted, coming and going, 628 pounds of carbon dioxide. That was my carbon footprint for coming to this conference. Now, I did not cue in my credit card to buy Absolution, I can tell you that, but some people would. Not many people yet, but some people would. Now, how do you, a little more specifics about calculating a carbon footprint. Essentially, this may be too much information, but most corporations would account for what's called Scope 1 emissions and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 1 would be the direct emissions associated with the tractors on your farm, with the combustion of propane to heat your buildings if you're on a hog farm. Scope 2 would be the consumption of electricity that you have on your farm to run the well, to run the feed motors, to run the fans, and so on, results in the emission of carbon dioxide at that coal-fired power plant, somewhere else. And if you really want to get into detail, you're going to calculate Scope 3 because you've got employees driving to your business, emitting greenhouse gases, and the distance that they travel, there's an impact with that. And your employees taking business travel and so on. Let's see. When you calculate the carbon footprint, depending upon how the power is created in your states, some states a lot of hydro or nuclear, a lot of states a lot of coal-fired production of electricity. But there are all sorts of models that take into account how electricity is created in your state or region, which goes into the calculation of your carbon footprint. Now, I've talked a lot about regulations internationally. I've talked about what may come in this country. But why does it matter to you as people, professionals in the pork industry? Walmart has leapfrogged over any potential regulations in dictating, that may be a strong term, in encouraging people in the supply chain that if you want access to our store shelves, you're going to have to tell us what your carbon footprint is, number one, and number two, what you're going to do to decrease it. And the first industry they picked on is the dairy industry. Long story short, I attended a dairy sustainability summit in Arkansas, in Rogers, Arkansas, I think it was late June. Walmart had been working with the dairy industry for the last 9 months, stating that in a very kind manner, suggesting that they get ahead of this issue and be able to tell them what their carbon footprint is and what they're going to do about it. What came out of that sustainability summit is an industry-wide commitment to the world at large that the United States dairy industry, even though they have achieved enormous reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, going from 23 million cows 30 years ago to 9 million cows today and producing more milk with a third of the cows, they've achieved incredible reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but they committed to be able to retain preferred status with Walmart. They committed to a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 for the average gallon of U.S. produced milk. The pork industry has been contacted by the folks at NPB, by Walmart, and I'm happy to say that the National Pork Board has become geared up and is aggressive. We convened a group of stakeholders about 6 weeks ago in Des Moines, and the direction is clear to begin to determine what the carbon footprint is of a pound of U.S. produced pork, and we will understand that and over time debate and decide on what sort of commitments that we will agree to decrease it. Now, Randy Stacker at breakfast this morning queued me up perfectly. He made the comment that, I'm not afraid of how the industry can deal with the transition from gestation crates to pen housing. We're going to be able to do that and do it well. But if you tell me that I have to decrease my greenhouse gas emissions by, some figure like 50% in the next 4 years, I don't know how to do that. And that could be a big concern. I'm not standing here suggesting that we will agree to that, but we will be impacted by the overall effort to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions associated with pork. There's already been a stab at this. This is a busy slide, but the point is this comes out of a draft report in the United Kingdom from the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, DEFRA. And their scientists have calculated the carbon footprint per metric ton of product for these different species. The numbers are not all that important, but the position in relation to each other is, and it's kind of common sense. Broilers convert at 2 to 1. They're the most efficient. This figure right here is basically 3.4 kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of product. Layers are next. Actually, pigs are third. Pigs, about a 3 to 1 feed conversion overall. Turkeys are right in there. And then when you get to dairy, with enteric emissions of methane, with feed conversion, of course, in beef at 5 or 6 to 1, you get into some serious numbers. And basically, if you want to put this on a pound basis, you're looking at about basically 4.6 pounds of CO2 emissions for a UK produced pig per pound of retail product. Who knows what it'll be for this country? But essentially, feed conversion efficiency is everything to what your greenhouse gas emissions are. If you want to reduce your carbon footprint, you're going to use every tool in your arsenal to become more efficient, to grow pigs faster. The less days those pigs spend on Earth, the more, or the lower your greenhouse gas emissions are going to be. You're going to use ractopamine. You're going to, use the very best genetics possible. You're going to use every arsenal to grow pigs faster, and you're going to pay attention to your consumption of energy on the farm in terms of electricity, in terms of lighting, and those sort of things. And capturing the methane that's produced, I hope it doesn't become mandatory. I doubt it will. It hasn't in Europe yet. But this is a real opportunity for generating revenue in the future. These are slides just showing some digesters that have been implemented in this country. Is there enough carbon revenue today to pay to cover lagoon? This is business as usual. This is the baseline scenario where significant emissions of methane are occurring from uncovered lagoons. Just last week in Clinton, EPA put on a workshop where a carbon company, actually a competitor, received a grant to cover an 8,000 head hog farm lagoon at Lillington, North Carolina, with this 60 mil impermeable cover. These are weights to channel the water, and underneath that is a biogas collection system. And here is a port for a recycle pump, and here is a flare. That biogas is captured, metered, and flared, and is generating carbon credits. It's not enough to pay for the project. It's a demonstration project that only occurred thanks to a grant. But carbon in this case is, that carbon is being traded over the counter, probably $6 a ton. When it gets to be $20 or $30 a ton, we may see a lot of that. The technology's here. It's available. It's just not economically feasible. So, is it hot air? I don't think so. Is it a hot opportunity? Depends. If you're one of the early actors, it could be a hot opportunity. If you wait and see what everybody else is doing, you'll probably get left behind. I think my message today can be summarized in 3 points. The train has left the station. Whether or not you believe in global warming doesn't matter. The train's left the station, and the rest of the world is doing something about it. It's like a freight train. I'd encourage you to learn a bit about it and quit kidding yourself if you think it's going to go away. Secondly, it is complex. I don't know much about the carbon markets, but I continue to learn a lot. It's very complex. And that's why companies like ours can carve out our niche in this business, because we do know about it and we can help people navigate through it. And whether or not it's an opportunity or a threat, I think is up to you. Thank you.